Feel free to leave comments in the box, in the chat box throughout, if you have things you'd like to share, things you'd like to say. Actually, maybe as this event is all about place, it might be quite nice just for you to sort of drop into the chat box where you are and maybe be as specific as possible. It'd be really interesting to know where everyone's tuning in from. We're talking to you from Mersey Island today, which is an island on the Essex coast, about 30 minutes from Colchester. Let's have a look. So we've got a few people in London, Chingford, Berlin, Lewisham, Huddersfield, Istanbul. It's going quick.
Wow,
there's loads. St Ives, Oxford, Turkey, Exeter, Hastings, Cork, Philippines. Fantastic.
Wow,
that's really great to see where everyone is this morning. So yeah, I'd like to ask Jess to join us now. Jess is from Art Exchange, our partner for this event.
Hello, hi, welcome everybody, and thank you first of all to Daniel and Clara inviting me to partner with them on a landscape imaginary. I'm the curator from Art Exchange. I think probably one of the closest galleries to Daniel and Clara. Now they've moved to Essex. And I guess I just wanted to first say, I don't think you can underestimate the impact artists like Daniel and Clara insights can have on an area. We've already got their 1 minute lockdown films on the island, and look forward to other work they're going to be sure they're making. They're so prolific that they'll be making now that they're based in Essex. We know what an impression they've made on other places we're focusing on today, and look forward to Stella Keen, Andrew Kötting, Ben Rivers and Susan Owens expanding on their relationship to place and the inspiration their places have had on their work. So having lived in Essex myself for most of my life now, over 30 years, I think I'm officially an Essex girl. I'm proud of it. And Mersey, where Daniel and Clara live, is a really special place to me and my family. It's where we canoe to and bike to, and we go there for the oysters. You can sit down by the estuary and eat the most delicious oysters. If you bike there, you're actually carbon neutral, which is a really good, so you can kind of enjoy that, because the oysters in the area, well, just growing literally next to where you're eating, they take more carbon from the atmosphere than they actually use. And the area around, I'm getting a bit nerdy about it, but getting kind of fascinated that it's turned into a marine conservation area with loads and loads and loads and loads of more oysters being farmed and grown in the area, and it's actually becoming more carbon neutralizing than the Amazon rainforest. So you can be very proud about that, Daniel and Clara, as an area to come from. And it's got this fantastic history that kind of accompanies the oysters. So I think if you walk around the bottom of Mersey, you come across an old J-class yacht. That was one of the yachts that was used by the King George, whoever, in the 1920s in the America's Cup. And that's because it's now sort of stuck in the mud, falling apart and turned into a houseboat. But back in the day, the oystermen were so fast at fishing because they had to get the oysters that they also used to go and get from the North Holland, get across to the London markets. They became so fast that they were racers in the summer while the oysters were spawning and next year's crop was regrowing. And hence this beautiful, elegant, long hull sort of stuck in the mud in Mersey. So I think it's got all these sort of fascinating stories to tell, and I'm really looking forward to the impact Daniel and Clara are going to make. And I think they're a very particular way of working out in the landscape and then coming back into the studio and working with the digital, and how they manage to do both, which I guess is something that all of us are having to figure out, and all the speakers will be doing today. So thank you, Daniel and Clara, and thank you everyone else for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to everything everyone's got to say.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and we're so happy to be partnering with Art Exchange for this event. it's really interesting to hear this, you know, we're still discovering this area. So to hear these sort of different things about the oysters and that and the boat, it's things that we haven't really sort of looked into yet or discovered. So yeah, we know that the more we explore, the more we're going to kind of pull back layers and find new things. So so yeah, this event today is being presented as a part of an Arts Council funded project, which, as you know, is called Landscape Imaginary. And this has come about really as a part of our unexpected relocation to Mersey Island. We were here visiting family just before the first lockdown was announced, and because of this, we decided to stay. And of course, at first, we were expecting that maybe the lockdown would last a few weeks or maybe a month or even a couple of months at most. But as you all know, it sort of went on, and we really just then decided, okay, we're going to stay for a while. And you know, it's really like the more time we spent here, the more the place started to kind of like get under our skin and start to weave its way into our imaginations. And now, over a year later, we're seeing that actually we really want to stay here for some time. So we have quite a wide-ranging practice. We work with photography, installation, performance, and correspondence works. But at the heart of everything we do is the moving image. And our work over the past couple of years has focused on place, and particularly landscapes. And we use this term landscape imaginary to describe the zone where our work exists. And this is a space where we see the inner and outer experience being treated as one. It is the phenomenological experience of place, but it's also the dream of the landscape and the narratives that we weave around it. So today we're going to take you on a journey to some of the places that we've lived over the past 10 years that we've been working together, and explore how the spirit of each of those places has impacted on our creative process. And we're describing this event as being expanded research. And what we wanted to do is not only talk about this impact of these specific places on our practice, but to kind of expand upon that and look at how other artists and people have responded to those landscapes as well. And we've at first thought we could kind of just bring in our research, read some quotes and show some clips and some stills from other people's work. But we wanted to kind of experiment with how we could give a presentation like this. So we've invited a group of guests, people who are inspiring to us, to help us bring this to life and add their own kind of reactions and contributions to each of these places. So I'd just like to, we'll introduce each guest along the way, but I'd just like to say a thank you up front to Andrew and Eden Kötting, Susan Owens, Ben Rivers and Stella Keen for being with us here for this event today.
So we'll get on with our journey. Our story begins in Brighton. We met one afternoon in November 2010. And it was only a few weeks until we started our first collaboration. It was a kaleidoscopic feature film called Savage Witches. Savage Witches is a film about creative freedom, imagination, and it's really an exploration of the possibilities of cinema as an art form. It's a brightly colored and playful film where the narrative moves from one sequence to the next in an associative way. Each scene sort of bursts out from the previous one. And the story follows two girls who seek to transform their reality through magic. And the magic that they use in turn transforms the very material of the film that they're in. Our collaboration started as a shared passion for cinema and art and an excitement about bringing these two things together. And in Savage Witches, we drew from a great variety of inspirations, from children's literature to Golden Age Hollywood, American underground movies, Czech New Wave cinema, Fauvist painting, fairy tales, and myths. And in many ways, the film is our reaction to the cultural climate of that time. On one hand, there was this kind of drab realism, and on the other hand, there was superhero movies. And we wanted to bring back formal experimentation, personal expression, and a more romantic vision of what moving image art could be. Savage Witches was the big bang of our collaboration and our life together. Everything that we've done, we can trace back to this first film and see that there was a seed of it already there. It's a work of cinematic witchcraft, a ritual binding of our lives together into a single artist, two artists dedicated to a shared life of creative exploration. And we've now been working together for 10 years, and the conversations that started then with this film continue to this day. Brighton is a place of great energy. There's something very youthful and playful in the air. It's an extrovert city. There's always things going on. It's very busy and bustling. And our life there was very social. We were always meeting people, and we'd often go in the street and meet someone that then would become a collaborator and a friend. And this isn't really something that we've experienced anywhere else. And the social energy of the place deeply impacted our work then. We used to hold regular screenings in our studio, and friends would come and gather to watch films and discuss works from the history of cinema. We used to watch at this time a lot of European art house and experimental films, and the discussions would go on late into the night. And there was this passion for art in the air, and this fueled our work. If we got excited about an idea, or if we saw something in a film that, or a painting that excited us, we wanted to try it out for ourselves and see what it meant for us. When we tested our ideas through the creative process. And this was very important. Through this process, we were questioning what cinema and art could be for us in a practical way and in a dialogue with the history of art. Brighton has a history as a place of decadence and extroversion and transgression. It's been a seaside resort since the 1700s, and this spirit of leisure and pleasure remains to this day. We can't really help but associate the place with being on holiday, even while we were living there. The piers and the crowded beaches and the constant parties were a part of the life of the town. It's a place of joy and having fun. And sat in the heart of the town is the pavilion built by the Prince Regent in the early 1800s. And the building looks as if it was conjured in a dream of Arabian Nights. It's blending styles throughout. It's excessive and theatrical. It's a monument to the imagination and the materialization of fantasies. And Savage Witches is a film made in this spirit. It too is excessive, mixing styles, highly artificial, personal, and expressionistic. It's a highly personal fantasy brought to life without constraints. We filmed a lot around the town, but the locations that we enjoyed filming the most were the gardens and the parks, which were in full bloom as we filmed in the height of summer. There's a generous dose of English stories here, Alice in Wonderland and The Secret Garden. But of course, there's also, and we can't help but be aware of this, an Edenic connection. Savage Witches was our own version of the creation myth, and these parks were our paradise gardens. We never really thought about landscape and place as a central subject at this point, but we used to speak a lot about the symbolic readings of the different places and locations that we used. Our work then was more overtly symbolic than it is now, growing out of our two key frameworks, which is the psychological and the mythological. And these two perspectives can still be found in our work today, but they operate on a lower frequency maybe, or less theatrically. But this interest in the mechanisms of consciousness and perception and how we use narratives to make sense of the chaotic experience of existence, this is still a constant concern for us in our work. A major influence on us at this time was an artist who spent most of his life living in Brighton. And this is someone who, in our view, is one of the greatest British post-war artists. That is painter, poet, and filmmaker Jeff Keen. Jeff Keen lived in Brighton from the early 1950s until his death in 2012. His work in film, performance, sound art, and painting was deeply connected to the spirit of the place. And to watch his films is to enter into his own cinematic vision of Brighton life, populated by characters inspired by comics, movies, and literature. He frequently took his art to the streets, painting directly onto the walls of the city or filming at the beach or the local tip. So we'd now like to invite Stella Keen to join us. Stella is an artist. She's the daughter of Jeff Keen and the director of his archive. And she'll be taking us into Jeff's universe and exploring the impact of Brighton and place in his work.
Thanks so much. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that okay. Can you all hear me okay? Hopefully you can. So although he's very much associated with Brighton, my father's romantic connection with the land and sense of place begins and ends in Wiltshire. From a long line of peasant farming stock, my father grew up being close to nature, always his favourite place to be. He had a great affinity with animals and loved nature and gardening, as well as art. In later years, he always longed to return to the West Country, but never did. He realised his memory of the place was always going to be at odds with the changing reality. In his early 20s, he was exploring surrealism and the neo-romantic British art movement with its reflections on the spirit within the English landscape between the wars. Top right is his bedroom in Wiltshire with a work painted directly on the wall, very much in the style of the Chilean artist Roberto Marta, an artist he greatly admired. Bottom right is from his bird sketchbook, which was painted at the age of 16 from observations in the fields. He would go out for hours observing birds and painting them. For Keen, the poet's cot or cottage is considered the ideal location for the artist to live and work in. My father's later work always reflected a nostalgic longing for rural England and the Arcadian idyll. Every day he painted watercolours in sketchbooks, which are his diaries in effect, notations of ideas always set in an imagined or remembered rural, urban or domestic scene. He scribbled random notes and wrote letters, but never actually wrote in diaries. The artworks and films serve as his multi-layered diaries. Then came Suffolk. Conscripted into the army at 18, he was stationed mainly in Suffolk, where his mother's side of the family came from. This was a life-changing experience and first introduced the idea that landscape could also function as an experimental playground. He served in the Royal Engineers, working in special ops on new top secret tank and airplane engine developments, which were then tested in the fields and on the beaches there. At this time, he was starting to really explore being an artist while thrown into the harsh realities of war, as well as surrealism. Neo-romantic artists such as Eric Ravilius, Paul Nash, Edward Burrough, John Craxton and John Minton resonated with him at this time. Demobbed in 1948, Keen moved to the bombscape that was London then, and voraciously took in the cultural life there. It was here that he saw abstract expressionist work for the first time, as well as surrealist art. In the 60s, he was very active on the exploding London underground scene, inspired by his contemporaries, most importantly by Gustav Metzger and the Fluxus movement. By this time, he was working in film as well as painting, exploring multi-screen performance work. He collaborated with a lot of artists at that time, most of which centered around the Better Books amazing site on Charing Cross Road, and led him to founding the London Filmmakers Co-op with Steve Dwoskin and others. But he also worked with Anaya Lockwood and Jeff Nuttall, and they recorded the amazing soundtrack to his film Marvo Movie. Then came Brighton. He happened to visit Brighton in the early 50s and met my mother, and the rest was history, as they say. This quote here on the left is from White Dust, one of his films, and it's a classic kind of statement about what his life was like then. So this idea of using what's there in the homemade is very prevalent with my dad's work. It very much comes from the ready-made ideas of the surrealists and stuff, as well as this kind of idea of being able to just use whatever is available, basically. So my parents settled in the Seven Dials area of Brighton, just around the corner from where early film pioneer George Albert Smith had lived, and who'd built a film studio in St Answell's Park. My father loved the fact that Smith had done this, that he was just using what was nearby to be creative. He loved the handmade local feel of Smith's work and referenced Smith's film studio location in his film diaries. Top right is my dad on location of filming Whale, one of his earliest films. This landfill site at the Sheepcote Valley, Whitehawk rubbish tip, was an extraordinary place. I have amazing memories of that as a child, I can tell you. And it was where people used to dump literally anything and everything. Whole household contents were there, as well as burnt out cars. So it was a ready-made, amazing set, basically. It became the perfect experimental playground for my father and his work. So it was basically the backdrop for many of his films and artworks at the time. It was just a great space to work with. Here he could make his inner landscapes a reality. Paintings and film work merged with the burnt out detritus of this chalky world. The archetypal movie characters he created with friends and family moved between films and artworks, always playing in the bombed out remnants of England's dreaming. Unloved urban spaces were his playground. This is circa 1971, when my father was doing stenciled graffiti on the walls of Brighton, long before Banksy. Performances were also staged randomly and unceremoniously across Brighton. On the right is an early collaborator with Jeff, the Australian concrete poet Jazz H. Duke, who was Mottler the word killer in the films. Most interior shots in my father's no-budget epics were shot within a very small area in their apartment at the time, first in an attic flat in 14 St Michael's Place, then round the corner at 30 Vernon Terrace. My parents lived and worked together in a very small space, creating magical mysteries and grand illusions. I was brought up and learnt a lot from this strange, fantastic environment they created. It was a kind of microcosmic universe, all of its own. Nature always beckoned though. It was readily available a short distance from where we lived. It's very easy to access nature from Brighton, which is one of the great things about it. The return to the Arcadian dream of being closer to nature is a constant reference throughout his work. And then there's the elementals, which are always a very important part of his work as well. The sea has mystical properties and often serves as a backdrop for romantic longing or Keen's take on the crumbling of civilization. Fire is always the great leveler, a destructive yet creative power. Out of the ashes, something new is created. And finally, we have the sentimental journey. I took this set of Polaroids of my father dressed as Silverhead in the early 80s, not long after my mother had left home. That Sunday early morning that we did this, we took these sets of photos. Going around these specific locations in Brighton is such a vivid memory still. These photos will form a small book I plan to publish called The Return of Silverhead. Each location featured has a special meaning to my father and I, and marks a poignant reflective change in his way of working. The focus on groups of anarchists at play, which we saw earlier in his work, changed to the focus on the lone artist this time. Still at play, but more introspective with romantic memories. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you.
Okay, so after sorry, one moment. So yeah, after our time in Brighton, we spent a summer living in the old town of Hastings, and Hastings is just a short way along the coast from Brighton. And much of our time in Hastings was spent walking on the country park between Hastings and Fairlight. We'd head out most mornings with our cameras and explore this beautiful green space as if it was our own open air studio. And we really loved it there. There's the woods covered hills and the cliffs and the rocky beaches and there's caves. And we just really loved sort of exploring these places, and that seemed to just blend seamlessly with our imaginations. The pre-Raphaelites were quite frequently on our minds, as the house where we were staying sat next to St. Clement's Church, which is where Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Lizzie Sedal were married. And William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millay and Edward Lear had also spent some time here. So one evening we were sat in our rooms reading when we heard all this shouting in the streets below. We looked out of the window and there was crowds gathering and all heading down the street. And they were going towards the country park. And we heard that they were going there because the beacon was going to be lit. So we grabbed our video camera and followed them to see what was going to happen. And Hastings, like a lot of Sussex towns and villages, takes its community rituals quite seriously. The nearby town of Lewes is known for its extreme passion for bonfire night, and Hastings itself has Jack in the Green, which is a spring festival which has dramatic and violent undertones. So we knew that whatever reason the beacon was going to be lit, that it would be a dramatic and exciting event. So that evening, we shot a short film called Exterior Fire at Fairlight Glen. And this became the first in a series of short films called our Exterior series. And this is 5 landscape films, and each one focuses on a different element, such as waves, sea mist, wildflowers, trees at night, and fire. So we're going to show you this film now. It's 5 minutes long. We're going to give you a link in the chat box, and it will open in a new window. So this particular film took the things that we experienced that evening, and as well as the memories of that evening, as the raw material. As we stood there on the cliff top watching the fire roaring away above our heads, we found ourselves thinking about Thomas Hardy's book, Far from the Madding Crowd. There's a scene in which the barn is on fire and all the farm workers are rushing around trying to put it out. And somehow the people gathered there in the dark and the intensity of the orange glowing beacon stirred this to our minds. And we also found ourselves thinking about another chapter in the book where the dog chases sheep off of the cliff top, killing them. And this made some kind of sense because nearby to where the beacon was, it is the location where this painting by William Holman Hunt, Our English Coasts, was painted. And this obviously depicts sheep on a cliff edge. So all of these memories of art and literature were colliding in our minds with the experience of being there, watching the burning beacon. And the film takes both the inner and outer experiences on equal terms. Both are treated as realities, one out there and one within. This space between inner and outer realities manifests in our work as a merging of documentary and fiction. Sometimes our work appears to be like a document, but is in fact a fiction, and sometimes it appears to be an artifice, but is actually a document. And we like to blur the lines between these two things because we believe that reality and imagination aren't as separate as people commonly like to believe. Reality is both the world out there being received through our perceptive mechanisms, but it's equally our projections out onto the world. So the true experience of that evening in Hastings was made up in part of an external reality, us standing watching the beacon on the cliff top, and then in part the inner emotional and mental experience in which we made personal associations, drawing on things seen in the past and things imagined. And we realized that this experience of reality is one of layering, and that the way we make meaning is in the connections between these layers. And another thing we find endlessly fascinating is the way that each of us will have a totally unique experience of reality that will differ from everybody else's. No two people will experience the same thing in exactly the same way. And this is something that we're frequently thinking about when we make work. So we'd like now to invite Andrew and Eden to join us. I'm sure many of you know their incredible films. Andrew is a filmmaker who we really admire, and we're really delighted that he and Eden can be here with us today in full costume to present a hauntological journey through their sound and image archive, which was created in Hastings and St Leonard's. So welcome both.
Thank you, both of you and everybody that's out there. And Eden's going to do a brief introduction and then we'll take it from there. So what would you like to say? That's a hello. My name. So hang on. It's Eden. Yeah. What else would you like to say? This is Daddy. And this is Daddy. So yeah, I'm Andrew and this is Eden, just in case there's any confusion. And yesterday we spent the whole day kind of trawling through work that we'd made in or around St Leonard's, Hastings, and we've put together an 8-minute hauntological, I guess, gadabout. But one of the things that I guess needs to kind of be echoed from what was said earlier by Daniel and Clara, there's something about St Leonard's, Hastings. We're actually talking to you from an old studio in Silverhill, just up, in fact, not far from where Stella is. And it's always been a rich vein to mine. We moved down here from London 17 years ago, and the work that's spilled out of our kind of 17 years has been pretty intensive. But Eden and myself, when we made the film Gallivant 25 years ago this year, I had no idea in hindsight that this stretch of coastline would be so rich and fecund. So in I'm now just going to share the screen, and we're going to run you what we edited from. In fact, these are snippets, both sound and image, from Gallivant, Edgeland Mutter, Because the Rest is Silence, The Sun Came Dripping, A Bucket Full of Gold, Edith Walks, The Whalebone Box, Diseased and Disorderly, All at Sea, buoyed by the irrelevance of their own insignificance. So I think that's the most important thing to bear in mind when we run this. So we too have been buoyed by the irrelevance of our own insignificance. Right, I'm just going to make this big. Right, you ready? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's run this. Oh, there we go.
Things were so strange on the pebble shore in front of me that I realized we were looking at a process of reverse evolution. And why I liked it was like someone had pulled a rug out from under England and everything had slipped down and you couldn't go any further.
So it's by the ocean? No. Where does the whale go? In her head. She's imagined the whale in her head. Okay. And she shot the whale in her head to make a box from the bone of the whale. Uh-huh. But if she hung the whale in her head, where did she got the whale bone? From the dead whale. In her mind? Yes.
Memory, a scrap of language, lines of verse that cannot be translated, time past or future visions.
And what is this woman doing? I'm not sure. It depends on the gun. It's real or fake. It's a real gun. So maybe she is hunting. Is she alone or is somebody with her? I'm with her. I'm photographing her. Mm-hmm. What has she got on her head?
Hello?
That was a brilliant fish. It seemed to have a woman inside. Is it? Glamorous, such a woman.
Where's the key?
Ah, Ahab. He's tracing her. Yeah. Bubbles. Ooh, here's a sheepish-looking character with breath.
Breasts, these are nipples.
So the clouds with bits of rain forming at the bottom of the clouds. But they're beautiful. It doesn't really matter, does it?
And this character is swimming through the molasses of life.
Oh yes, it is like painting the clouds of our own making.
And did you know that seawater is good for the bowels? Sea air does good, if you can get some good sea air. Andrew, do you know that air is sexually exciting for you? Oh, I don't know. All depends who you're with.
Here, the stored images of past experiences are projected into the future.
I was wondering if you could
That which I was looking at is a harpoon. Wow.
I didn't know.
It all goes so quickly. And then there's Eden looking out. Now it's
clear those baguettes. Oh, binoculars.
This is an animal that we need to try and get off the south coast of the UK.
For a place in the middle. To plod and to keep plodding. This gate keeps artifacts.
And it's this idea that history is a solid. Doesn't get compartmentalized. The past is never put away. But all of its figures are still interacting with us. Over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, bring forth.
Her brow was creamy as the crested wave. Her sea blue eyes were wild, but nothing promised that is not performed.
I do like to be beside the seaside. I do like to be beside the sea. Check it out, that's it.
Astral ones in their chariots, and nothing is as it was, and nothing will be again, except that we pace on together instead, remorselessly, stupidly, looking for answers that will never be found.
If the power were granted you, you would dare to be changed, as you are changing now, into the shape you dread beyond a merely human. But the imagination fails, and the doors of the senses close on the child within. To break out of yourselves, a dry fire eats you. Come, bathe in these waters, forever inheriting his salt kingdom.
And the sky went warm, and the sun rose dripping, a bucket full of gold.
Yeah, after we go to the toilet. There's no rush to go to the toilet. Right, so that's something we put together. It's quite a nice throwback for the, yeah, I'm unmuted, for the both of us yesterday. And I noticed that Ben Rivers actually got very excited briefly for about 10 seconds at the beginning of that, because he actually shot that footage of me swimming into the English Channel many years ago. And I'm aware of the time, and I want to keep this succinct, but one of the things that some of you might have been aware of, that Eden is here with me now. She's spent a lot of time either eating mango, but she was also drawing, and there were a couple of little snippets that this is what she's been working on. These are self-portraits, and these characters have been featuring in a lot of the work over the last, I guess, 5-10 years. And in fact, the final shot of what we just showed you was Eden at work in her old studio in the Old Town in St Leonard's, not far, in fact, where Daniel and Clara were. On the bend there, we were just up the road from the church. So the kind of happenstantial connections are normally always there. And I also wanted just to conclude, I wrote a kind of alphabetarium many years ago, and I realized that there is a nice section which seemed to resonate with some of the things that have been said today under the letter P, which is for places and contemporary moving image practice and polemical discourse within the historical context. Post-Cathar and preeminent evaluation of the impact and role of the artist always has been and always will be. The place displaced and the coordinated zone share their projection when it comes to territory. We move through it on ceaseless journeys towards understanding. Some people carry it like a burden or a memory or both. They bring other places to other people who then take a little of the weight to mix it with their own longing to create its narrative. So not really place as landscape at all, but more of Manley Hopkins' inscape, consciousness as it might look if it were dimensioned into, say, video or film, searching for works that have been to the edges and looked over, shamanic flights returning from the far reaches with the word of the void's whistling rim. I just felt that was quite apt. So when the film was running, I went to my own website, which is an act of pure narcissism, of course, and dug out the P for place. And you can find that on the website, along with some of the work that we showed briefly there. Eden's animated drawings, in fact, all at sea, are things that we've been working on here in Silvertown for quite a while. So that would conclude our presentation. I think that coming at exactly 15 minutes and 40 seconds. So we're on budget. We're definitely on budget.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you.
Yeah, and the other thing, just in case, we're disappearing now because throughout that, Eden's desperate to go to the toilet. So I'm about to take her down to the toilet.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to take a 5-minute break now. So we've spent some time this morning now on the south coast. We've been to Brighton and we've been to Hastings, and it seems to be there's some connections between those places. There's a lot of dressing up, there's a lot of play, and there's a strong element of ritual that seems to exist sort of in the atmosphere and in the way that the different artists and ourselves have responded to these places. So when we come back, in 5 minutes time, we're going to take a journey across the sea to Portugal. And so stay logged into Zoom and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
So after leaving Hastings, we found ourselves broke, homeless, and unsure about where to go next. But after a couple of months of going through this uncertainty, an opportunity came up to go to Portugal and live rent-free in a house in a small seaside town called Espinho. For a while, we'd been talking about wanting to grow our own food and attempt to live self-sufficiently. So as the house had a garden and living costs were so low, we took this as a chance to go there and try this. We lived there for about 6 years. We were growing vegetables and keeping chickens and buying fish from the local fishermen. The house where we were living was large, but it was lacking in most of the comforts of the modern world. There was no heating. It was very damp, and sometimes the house would fall apart around us. But we didn't mind. There was a great freedom that came with living there, and we made the most of it. Espinho is a fairly small place, and it's very quiet for most of the year, apart from the summer months where it becomes very busy. And even though it was often sunny, the heat was undermined by a strong northern wind, which blew relentlessly throughout the year. And also sometimes a dramatic transformation took place when the mist rolled in from the sea, decreasing visibility and invading the house with dampness. For much of our time in Portugal, we were living in a kind of isolation. we would often go several months without seeing other people. But this was also a very busy period creatively. We made the most of having space and time to dedicate every waking moment to our work. And this experiment with how to live went beyond just growing food. We went on a deep exploration of our own psychology and behavior. We became very interested in Jungian psychology and spent a lot of time analyzing our dreams and attempting to unpick our sense of self. We also wanted to understand what creativity really is and what are the best absolute conditions for it. So we experimented a lot with how our routine, our diet, meditation, and all the activities of daily life impacted on our work. The work we made during this time was very much inward looking, exploring fantasies, dreams, and inner visions. This was in part due to the fact that we never really felt at home there. We never felt that we could truly connect with the place or the culture there. And we often had a feeling that we didn't know where we belonged. We felt a bit like we were living in a world of our own, sustained by our imagination and cut off from the rest of the world in this kind of isolation and exile. And this feeling permeated all of our work then. We saw ourselves a little bit like monks, working away on mystical film texts and cinematic manuscripts. Our daily artistic work was a spiritual practice for us.
So in spite of our isolation, we were quite prolific at this time. We made several short and feature-length films and video installations. And all of this body of work we call our alchemical films. They are moving image works about psychological transformation, growing from this kind of inner exploration. In our final year in Portugal, the house where we were staying was sold. So we moved into an apartment closer to the city. But by this point, moving actually was a great relief because we were finding it quite increasingly difficult to live in the house as it was really falling apart around us. It had no heating, it was very damp, and it you know, occasionally the roof would fall in and we'd just constantly be kind of at battle with the decay of the building. But before we left, we wanted to create one more film there, and we shot a film called Plot Points. Now, out of all of the work that we made in Portugal, this one has the most sense of place. Plot Points is about the spirit of a Shvino. It took us the best part of 6 years for the place to seep into our imaginations in such a way that we could make a film about it. Sometimes you arrive in a place and it just clicks. It's almost like it exists within your psyche already. But a Shvino took a long time to weave into that dream space so that we could intuitively work in response to it. Ultimately, it was the constant presence of the sea and the mist and this sense of being cut off from the world that informed this film. Plot Points is a film about the ocean, sea mist, the colour blue, and a group of characters who drift along the beaches while washed in a sea of memories and dreams. It's very much inspired by French writer-filmmaker Marguerite Duras, whose own work often explores this sort of emotional state of characters and their relationship to seaside towns and this atmosphere of windswept beaches. So this period of living in a seaside town through on and off seasons, living as outsiders, feeling like exiles, wrapped up in our own inner artistic and psychological questioning. This was an incredible, amazing time that we had, but it was also very hard. And even though it gave us this time and space to work on building solid creative foundations for our future work, we realized after a while that it wasn't something that could be permanent for us. So we'd now like to invite Ben Rivers to join us. Ben is an artist filmmaker who I'm sure many of you are aware of. His brilliant films for cinema and for gallery often focus on outsiders and wanderers and hermits and people who are in some way living at a distance from society. So we're welcoming Ben here today to talk to us about this theme and his interest in this. Hi, Ben.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, it's been really great so far, especially following Andrew and Eden and Stella and Jeff, who artists who have meant a hell of a lot to me and were really important sorts of influences and catalysts when I started making films. In fact, and also the places that you've talked about, Brighton was where I went after I finished art school, where I went to Falmouth Art School and moved to Brighton afterwards, and with a group of friends, is the Brighton Cinematheque, and we showed Andrew's films, and I'd go up to his studio and pick up prints directly from him, which was really fun, and Jeff would do a screening usually about once a year, a sort of chaotic bombast of loads of his films, sort of all, not just playing on the screen, but all over the walls of the cinema. So it's really, yeah, I mean, just in terms of, these kind of, link ups you're talking about, it's really, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to talk in relation to them, as well as about landscape. I mean, when I was living in Brighton, as much as I loved the place, I was also dreaming about being elsewhere, and but I wasn't really sure where that elsewhere was, and also just wondering about the way that I wanted to live, and whether I wanted to live in a city or actually go off and live in the wilds. And I was reading a lot of literature at that time, which was also related to this idea of living off in the wilderness. And the one that definitely had the biggest impact was Knut Hamsun, who's an amazing Norwegian writer who also sadly became a Nazi sympathizer. But my favorite books of his were from the 1890s, so sort of way before his disgrace. And there's nothing to kind of preempt what happened to him politically. The books are not the kind of about the sort of superhuman.
Oh, I think we've frozen here a bit.
Oh, really? Am I here?
Yeah, Ben, as your internet's a bit sketchy, do you want to turn your video off and we'll go to the slideshow?
Yes, great idea. Great idea. Yeah. We don't need to see me anyway.
So Ben, did you ever actually try sort of, you said you were like interested in this lifestyle of sort of off-grid and working out where you wanted to be, whether it was in the city or, this kind of alternative lifestyle. Did you ever sort of attempt to kind of live like that or sort of toy with that?
Well, I think, in a way, I think what the films that I got into making were really, that was my way of approaching it, because I feel like filmmaking is so much so intertwined with my life. It's not that they're two separate things, as I think the same with you, the same with Andrew, the same with Jeff. Our lives, you can't separate them into a box of, say, like work and the rest of your life. They're completely intertwined. And so so I think, you know, instead of maybe actually going to try and live in the middle of the wilderness, I went there to find people who were doing that and to see what the reality of that was in the 21st century. And first of all, I followed this book, Pan, up to the north of Norway to try and find somebody who lived a similar kind of life, and drove around for about a month and didn't really find anybody, and then came back, and I was telling my friend, a friend of mine who also lived in Brighton, about, you know, this sort of failed trip to Norway. I mean, it was great, but and he said, oh, you should, I know this guy who might be the kind of person you're looking for. And it was Jake Williams, who lives in the middle of Clashendarroch Forest on the edge of the Cairngorms in Aberdeenshire. And yeah, so I went to visit Jake, and that was a really it was a really important kind of meeting for me, because I met this person who'd sort of chosen this life of wanting to be kind of in sort of deep connection with the landscape and nature, over and above his need to have human contact. And he does like humans, and this was really interesting to me. And it took me off on this trail of meeting various people who they weren't misanthropic at all. They actually really liked people. They liked visitors. So they, you know, in a way, they're kind of, their hermit-like existence was, in a way, there was still like contradictions to it, and I was really fascinated by this. But it also allowed me to live sort of vicariously through them and through my filmmaking, and not actually have to commit to doing it myself. Which, you know, in a way, as the films went on, I still loved coming back to London and being part of that as well. So I think, you know, I sort of selfishly got the best of both worlds, you know, in that I was able to, because I would stay places for a long time. Like, for example, we're seeing images of 2 years at sea now, and I think all in all, well, I can't actually remember how long, but I would go up for, you know, maybe 3 weeks or something each time I went to film, and I went about 5 times over the course of a year. So that's quite a chunk of time to stay up there. And, you know, a lot of the time it's not about just film. It's not about filming. It's also about being in that place and being with that person and talking, sitting around the fire and going for walks. And, you know, this family, so you've seen kids, these are stills from Our Liberty, which was made in 2008. So a couple of years after I'd met Jake and made This Is My Land. I mean, a lot of the people that I found, they were friends of friends, which was another nice thing. It was all about kind of very quite natural and intimate connections. And so I'd gone up to Scotland because my friend Joe Pepper had told me about this guy called Stuart, who'd spent 20 years reading Darwin. And he was a complete autodidact. He'd left school at 14 and had traveled and been in the army. And but when I went up to see Stuart and start making a film, he'd had to go to hospital to get some new knees. And so we then went kind of 10 miles up a dirt track and found this family called the Pococks, who was just living on this croft in the Highlands. And, you know, it's just, I just love kind of meeting these people who their relationship to the landscape is so entrenched. There's nothing kind of accidental about it. They're really their life is completely sort of intertwined with the world around them in a way that I feel like, you know, obviously a lot of the Western world has let go of a bit. You know, it's us and nature, and I think this is one of the problems that, you know, we're faced with, is this separation. And so, yeah, this is one of the things that I was really interested in trying to kind of capture on film. And yeah.
So I mean, you know, you're kind of engaging with place, but you're engaging with it through the people that you're meeting there. So there's this kind of, they're equally kind of place-based films, but they're also portraits, really, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, they are definitely portraits, but they're sort of simultaneous portraits of people and the place and the animals as well. The animals are always really important as well. Now I try and give them, you know, a good platform.
Yeah.
But again, like I think, like you were saying, I also it's not just observational. You know, I'm trying to like get to some point where it's yeah, it's trying to move beyond the observational and include you know, whatever you might want to call it, that non-fiction, it's kind of a non-fiction and fiction, dream, there's fantasy, I don't know. It's not like an objective truth. It's a moment between me and this person and this landscape, and that can include the so-called reality, but also the reality that goes on, you know, in our heads, in our
yeah. I think that's something that I think is really nice in your films, and it's something that we kind of, I think, do in our work as well. Which is have these moments where you don't know when it's document or fiction. There might be things that look like documents, but they're actually artifice, or things that look like the fiction, but they're actually documents.
Right.
And I wonder how these things grow for you as well in the work. Do these, when you bring in more dream aspects or fiction, do they grow from you, from the people that you're filming, or a mixture of both?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. It's probably more me. You know, for example, Jake, you know, in 2 Years at Sea, there's a moment where he's clearing out a caravan. Up to this point, the film has been fairly quotidian. The first sort of 15 minutes of the film, it's sort of his day-to-day life. And then I really wanted to sort of shift it so that you sort of know that, you know that it's, oh, thanks. Mum just bought me a coffee. Yeah, so that you're in this kind of supposed real world, but then the tone shifts and this caravan floats up into a tree, and then from that moment on, then you then can sort of question what you're looking at, because I think we should question what we're looking at in a film, and sort of know that this is a construction in a certain sense, you know, and it's a filmmaker's construction, and we're sort of manipulating the world.
And it kind of throws into question also what you've previously seen in
exactly, yeah.
That moment you're talking about, it kind of makes you think back to the scenes before, to kind of question, like, was there something anticipating this? Was there a kind of magic kind of brewing that we hadn't noticed? And I think that's quite nice, that it's sort of, it's very subtle, but then you kind of become aware of the sort of almost like the narrative present tense, past tense that you're experiencing. And I think that's how we experience reality, really. It's
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's really what we're trying to get at, is that you know, our reality is a mix of so many things. It's not a kind of clear linear experience that doesn't go off on like crazy tangents. I mean, our brains are working like crazy, constantly giving us new bits of information, or taking us into memory, or taking us into a bit of fantasy just when we walk down the road. And you know, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do my way in the films. You see it in Andrew's, he's doing it, but in a very different way. But I think it's a similar sort of like sense of not believing that life is just this sort of straightforward, very clear linear thing that we can just sort of stand back and look at. So yeah, that's why I want to sort of, that I also think that it's important for me in a way as a filmmaker that that I'm not pretending that that I'm making a accurate portrait of somebody, because I don't think that's possible. Like, to make an accurate portrait of Jake and his landscape is impossible. I'd have to spend literally my whole life with him.
Yeah.
And even then I probably wouldn't get it right.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
it would just be your perspective, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to remember that we are coming from a very specific subjective perspective, and for that to be present in the films. And so when and I think that's really your title for this, The Landscape Imaginary, that's basically sums it up really well. It's like, how do I relate to the landscape that I find myself in? And it involves not only just me looking and listening and smelling, but also imagining and putting my own kind of dreams or whatever onto it.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's really great to speak to you and hear these thoughts.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting.
So just a moment.
Okay, and we move on. So in 2017, there was a growing interest in our work in the UK. We were invited to give a talk about our work at Alchemical Landscapes, which is a research seminar at Cambridge University, investigating contemporary expressions of the link between art, landscape, and the visionary tradition. This became the first stop on a tour around the country, where we gave talks and showed our films at various art venues over 2 weeks. We traveled by train from Cambridge up to Scotland and via London, and then back down again, stopping off at a number of places along the way. We were instantly excited by the landscapes we were seeing everywhere we went. After so long of living in our imaginations and not feeling connected to place, we were suddenly pulled out of ourselves, and it was as if we were seeing the world for the first time. We were filming a lot along the way, and we were thinking about making a film about this journey, but we didn't have a very clear plan. And then on the last day of the tour, we visited Avebury. Avebury is a village in Wiltshire that sits inside a stone circle, and it's the largest stone circle in Britain. The place had a massive impact on us. the few hours that we spent there were an incredible experience and took us completely by surprise. Unlike the more famous Stonehenge, in Avebury, you can't really see the whole stone circle in one view. You have to walk around it, and somehow you get a much more intimate experience of the stones. You can get close to them and you can touch them. And you can see how each stone is different, and it feels like they all have their own personality and their own story. The stone circle itself is surrounded by a huge henge, which is a circular earthwork made up of a 5-meter high bank and then a deep ditch, which adds to this feeling that you're walking into a place apart from the normal world. Then about a mile away from the village, there is Silvery Hill, a mysterious man-made mound whose purpose is lost to history. Being in this landscape, it feels like you can really glimpse the vastness of time. You know that these monuments have been put there by people like us, and they feel very close. Like us, they were trying to find a way to live within the landscape, making their mark, rearranging it in ways that made it more meaningful to them and in accord with some mysterious inner necessity. Now, this place resonated with something deep within us and changed us. As we walked around the stone circle and out of the village towards Silvery Hill, we realized not only that we needed to come back to the UK, but also that new possibilities for our work were being born and that we needed to further explore these landscapes. But before going there, we knew very little about Avebury. We'd seen Derek Jarman's film and paintings, and some paintings by Paul Nash, but we knew nothing about the history of the place. Early on in the tour, we met up with our friend Toby Tatum, and when hearing that we were going to visit Avebury for the first time, he suggested that we watch Children of the Stones, which is an eerie TV series from the 1970s, which was shot on location there. And we watched this in the evenings in Airbnbs as we went along the journey. So when we arrived, this is what we carried with us: a little German and Nash and the strange atmosphere of Children of the Stones. Then, because of the significance of this visit, afterwards we became obsessed and spent more time researching, and we learned a lot more about the history of Avebury and also the significance that it has had for so many artists. For many artists, including Nash and Jarman, and others such as Joe Tilson, David Inshaw, Bruce Lacey, and many more, encountering Avebury seems to have been a turning point, like a kind of external catalyst for an inner change. And this really excited us to feel that we had made a similar connection and that there was a sense of a tradition of artists visiting this place at a significant moment in their practice. Why Avebury has had such a significant resonance for so many artists, particularly throughout the 20th century, we can't really know for sure. It seems to be something about the age of the site, dating to our Neolithic ancestors, but also the sense of mystery of it, the fact that we can't ever truly know why the stones were erected and what purpose they served. This wonderful unknowing means that these sites can become receptors to our projections, that when we encounter them, we also encounter what we bring to them. And for us personally, the monoliths, and particularly Silvery Hill, represent this great mystery of being human, the mystery of being alive and the mystery of existence. And in themselves, the monuments are a testament to this creative impulse in humans to try to make sense of these mysteries.
the film we made on the trip was called Notes from a Journey, a 70-minute film which uses the footage which was filmed on the tour, but that is presented not just as a document, but a film that is also a journey in itself, a first-person experience for the viewer. So as we've described, our work grows from our encounters with particular places, but simply photographing or filming those places isn't enough to express the reality of our experience. To truly express it, we must consider all of the layers coming into play, the physical sensations of the body, the thoughts and memories buzzing through our minds, and our personal and cultural associations which are activated within us. And in order to do this, we experiment with new forms and approaches to narrative, and also to the position that we put you in as a viewer. When we were editing Notes from a Journey, we began thinking about using land formations as structuring devices for our narratives. In plot points, we used the sea, in particular the eternal reoccurring motion of waves. And in Notes from a Journey, the narrative form is based on the pyramid-like shape of Silbury Hill. We structured the film around this shape, placing the high point or narrative climax at the center of the film rather than at the end where it would be in a more conventional film. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know this from watching Notes from a Journey, but it's something that can be felt. When we make a work, we always want to create experience where the structures and organizing principles have a visceral impact. You aren't instantly able to discern them consciously, but you feel them. They speak to the senses first and then to the intellect second. We want our work to be mysterious. It's important that the meaning is slightly out of reach. Now, this is because we're not really making message art. We're not making art to tell anybody what to think or feel, but instead want to create a space where you can encounter something which you have to make sense of on your own terms. And through this process, you can hopefully become aware of more how you personally think and feel, and how your own perceptive mechanisms are informing this. And in a way, we could describe what we're doing as making works of art that are equivalent to our experiences. And these equivalents in turn become experiences in themselves.
Avebury has remained significant to us. It was the catalyst for us moving to the UK, and it has also been the subject of a number of works since then. And it seems to stand as a sort of center in our psychological map of the world now. So when we finally moved back to the UK in 2019, we returned to Avebury and made a series of works which include letters, photographs, and a film called Revisiting. Revisiting is about this act of returning to a place of personal significance. It's about looking again at something which already has layers of personal meaning, but also which holds layers of historical and cultural meanings. And it takes the form of a holiday film. It was filmed on mini DV and plays across 2 screens. We also included fragments of text on screen taken from our notebooks, and like our other work, revisiting layers, inner and outer experiences. It's a very different film from Notes from a Journey. Notes from a Journey, being made during our fleeting visit, never settles or feels connected to place. It's filled with shots from train windows, traveling and floating through the landscape. And the landscapes are never seen clearly. But Revisiting feels much more like we were there. In Notes from a Journey, you only glimpse us in the landscapes a couple of times. Mostly you see us inside the B&Bs, sitting in the dark. There's a kind of depression to it. But in Revisiting, we're actively engaging with the place and walking around the stones and taking Polaroid photos. By the time that we made Revisiting, our feeling about place had changed. We no longer felt that we didn't know where we belonged. We felt a connection to a place and to a certain artistic tradition. and we had made an assertive decision to go where we wanted to be. So the work that we made when we return feels different. But the mystery of the place still persists, and we have the feeling that we'll never be done with returning to Avebury and looking at it again. So now we would like to invite Susan Owens to join us. Susan is an art historian and curator. She's the former curator of paintings at the V&A, and she's written a number of fantastic books on art history. And her latest book is Spirit of Place, Artists, Writers in the British Landscape, which we can't recommend enough. It's one of our favorite books on landscape art. Thanks, Susan, for being here.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Clara. And thank you for inviting me to speak. It's been a wonderful morning so far. And I'm just going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see that first slide. So what Daniel and Clara have asked me to do is to talk a bit about Avebury in the artistic imagination and really in the 20th century. So I want to look at Paul Nash and Derek Jarman. But first of all, I just want to look at Avebury itself for a moment, because as Daniel and Clara just said, it's a very strange place. It's very hard to get a sense of it unless you're there, and even then you can't really get an idea of the whole of it. It's a very strange place. You can only see a part of it, and that's partly because it's an extraordinary structure. It's absolutely enormous with this great outer circle, but within that there are two other stone circles as well. So it's one of the biggest and one of the most complex of stone circles, I think, not just in the UK but in Europe as well. And those of you who've been there will know that strange sense of just how close it is to places like Silbury Hill and West Kennet Avenue and West Kennet Long Barrow, all these prehistoric sites and sacred sites and earthworks. And you get this sense of Avebury being part of this massive sacred landscape. It's an incredibly special place. But I just wanted to compare it with Stonehenge for a moment, just thinking about artists looking at these places. You couldn't really get a prehistoric monument that's more different. Stonehenge is very obvious. You can see this amazing iconic view from afar. Here's Constable and Turner watercolours, as they're just done within a decade of each other, and they're both looking at Stonehenge underneath this great weather drama that's going on in the sky. But there's something very iconic about these trilithons, these three sort of gate-shaped stones. And also Stonehenge was very well known, even in the early medieval period. People knew about it, partly because there was a very popular medieval myth about how Merlin had brought the stones over from the west, from Ireland, they thought at the time, by some magical process. So it was very much part of a consciousness. People thought about it, even if they'd never been there and didn't really know what it looked like, it was still in their minds. But Avebury has a very different history. In fact, it wasn't really, well, I say discovered. I mean, of course, local people knew that the stones were there, but no one really knew what they were for until the incredibly late date of 1648, when this man, John Aubrey, happened to come across it when he was out hunting one day. And he said, I was wonderfully surprised at the sight of those vast stones, of which I'd never heard before, as also the mighty bank and ditch about it, observed in the enclosure some segments of rude circles made with the stones, whence I concluded they had been in the old time complete. Well, Aubrey was an antiquary, so he'd thought about Stonehenge a lot. So he was used to going around the country and looking at ancient sites, and he was brought up in Wiltshire. So it was extraordinary that he hadn't seen it before. But he was the first person who realized that it was ancient, although he had no way of knowing quite how ancient it was, but had some special significance. And it made a really deep impression. And he said that Avebury did as much excel Stonehenge as a cathedral does a parish church. So that's an incredibly strong statement for everyone who thought that it was Stonehenge that was the big place. So he must have felt something of that extraordinary atmosphere of Avebury. But superficially, Avebury is sort of more challenging for artists because of what I've said, what Daniel Clara had said. There is no vantage point where you can see the whole lot. You almost have to confront individual stones one by one. So I suppose the point I'm making is that the artists who are focused on Avebury tend to focus on its atmosphere, not to a visual wow factor, but to the sensation it produces of being immersed within it. And it sounds like an oddly paradoxical thing to say, but it's almost as though the artists who've responded most strongly to Avebury have been responding to something which is not just visual, it is almost beyond the visual. So the first artist I want to talk about is Paul Nash, who was one of the leading landscape painters of the first half of the 20th century. His career was really bookended by both world wars, the Great War and Second World War. And he was an official war artist in both, which I think makes him, if not unique, almost unique. And he was also involved in the international surrealist movement. So he had continental links, and throughout his work, you can see a surrealist way of experiencing the landscape keeps coming out, and we'll see something of that in a minute or two. But I think also that the scenes he witnessed and he drew and painted in the war, in the First World War, seeped into the way he thought about the English landscape when he returned, and gave partly a sort of a horror of the landscape, of something that lay beneath, but partly a sense of value as well. I think he was very deeply attuned to layers of myth and history that lay underneath the surface. There's always a lot going on in his work. And he also felt the idea of place very deeply. This is a lovely photograph of him clinging to a great standing stone in the Forest of Dean. And he, in his autobiography outline, he said, there are places just as there are people and objects and works of art whose relationship of parts creates a mystery, an enchantment which cannot be analysed. And that's something that comes out in his work as well, that he doesn't ever try to explain or to solve. He almost tries to deepen the mystery of the landscape. He first visited Avebury in the summer of 1933, and this is a photograph of Avebury by his friend John Piper. And this is how he described the stones at this point. This is Nash. He said, some were half covered by the grass and others stood up in cornfields and were entangled and overgrown in the copses, and some were buried under the turf. But they were wonderful and disquieting, and as I saw them then, I shall always remember them. Very soon afterwards, the big work of reinstating the circles and avenues began, so that to a great extent, the primal magic of the stone's appearance was lost. I think that's fascinating. He felt almost that the moment he got to see the stones, that was a hinge in time, because he'd seen them before the archaeologists came along. who were beginning to work on the stones. And Nash felt very ambivalent about it, and he sort of came up against the archaeologists. Some were his friends, and he knew what they were doing, and in some ways supported it. But in other ways, I think he was, it went against something he felt very deeply, which was that he thought that they were destroying something deep and important in the landscape, almost as though they're sort of pasteurizing the stones, clearing away their mystery by research and modern techniques. But there were two things that came together, I think, that really made Avebury one of the most significant sites for Nash, and he would return repeatedly to it. And one was that he felt that it was alive with a very special significance, a spirit of place, a genius loci. And the other thing was he developed this idea of what he called the object personage, which was, it could be something in the landscape like a great fallen tree, or it could be a standing stone, anything that looked odd or that had what he described as a kind of character or personality. So what he was interested in was something that, a kind of form in the landscape that he felt one had to deal with, have some kind of relationship with. His initial response was to photograph the stones, and this is one he took in 1933 in that first summer, and he called this stone personage. So he was obviously thinking about Avebury in those terms at the time. I love this. This is a slightly later, but I love the sense that this gives of, you know, Nash with his car driving around, looking at the circle close to. And this is another photograph he takes from the earliest period, where he's double exposed the image, which I think gives a lovely sense of the layers that we've been hearing about from Ben Rivers and from Daniel and Clara, the layers of memory and emotion and vision that make up our experience of looking at the landscape. It's far more than just vision, it's about these kind of layered views, and this really speaks to me about that. A year after Nash first visited, he painted this picture that he called Landscape of the Megaliths, that was based on his experience of Avebury. He wasn't actually in England at the time. He was ill for a lot of his working life, actually, but he was convalescing on the Riviera. But it's almost as though Avebury had seeped into his mind, and this is how it was transformed in his imagination and memory. I must say, I found it difficult to look at this painting for a long time because I didn't really understand it, and I think I felt that I had to solve it somehow. And what Daniel and Clara said a moment ago about how meaning is often slightly out of reach in their work, that really resonated with me, because that's sort of the key to how I began to look at this picture by Nash. It's not, he doesn't intend it as a puzzle to be solved. It's something much more dreamlike and strange and disquieting. One odd thing is that we seem to be hovering from overhead. It's as though we've got this bird's eye view of Avebury. And in a way, that's perhaps a response to the aerial photography, which archaeologists have been carrying out since the 1920s, which were giving them unprecedented views of ancient monuments like this. So it's almost as though Nash is translating that into his own bizarre vision. But it's almost here as though the circle, as though it might appear in a dream. So all the stones are sort of bulging. There's one that seems to be morphing into a kind of tennis ball at the top. And the hills on either side, you might expect it to be Silbury Hill, but they look more like the Wittenham Clumps in Oxfordshire, which are these two extraordinary hills, which are very like which are other sites that he becomes obsessed by as well. So lots of different things in this strange blood-like area of paint at the bottom. So very disturbing, but I think he's suggesting a mood, and he's really digging down to, I think, suggest something about the ritual significance of the stones. He's digging down beneath their appearance. The art critic Maivanwi Evans said of Nash, he has no interest in past as past, but the accumulated intenseness of the past as present is his special concern and joy. Now, I just want to quickly go on to say something about Derek Jarman as well, because he was very influenced by Paul Nash early on in his career, when he was making landscape paintings, and he made an experimental film called A Journey to Avebury in 1971. These are some stills from it. But he ostensibly, in this film, records a walk on a summer's day towards Avebury and then away again. And very like Nash, Jarman is interested in ancient landscapes, but also in the blurring of past and present and the blurring of dream and reality. So I'm just going to click through some stills as I just talk through the film. So much of the impact of A Journey to Avebury comes from a sense of unease as the modern technology of film rubs up against the ancient landscapes he's filming. And he filmed it on Super 8 film, which, and he in fact bought his own Super 8 camera that year. And it was a cheap kind of film to use, most often used for home movies. So it has this very characteristic grainy look, and it flickers, it's quite jumpy. And the effect of this is that we as viewers are very intensely aware of the medium. It's not like sort of modern digital recordings which tend to efface themselves and allow us to look through them as though they were an open window. It really imposes itself and it draws our attention. It has a distancing, rather alienating effect. So at a certain point in the film, quite suddenly, we find ourselves among the stones, but too close to get a real sense of our relationship to them. Instead, we're confronted by a succession of indistinct and dark shapes. They sort of bulge as though they're alive. And Jarman filmed this with a succession of static camera shots. There are a few tracking shots that he does in the stones themselves, but the effect of this is that as we're watching the film, we see this succession of dislocated fragments, but there's no smooth unfolding of the story, so it's disorientating. We never know where we are. And one of the effects is that it almost looks as though the camera is scanning the horizon for danger, or expecting it at any minute. So what we might see is just a tree or a sheep or a hillside or something, but the familiar becomes very strange. It takes on a very sinister dimension. There's a soundtrack that was added later. Jarman made it as a silent film, but there's in the soundtrack that was added, it's part birdsong and part electronic music recorded by Coyle, which has this wonderful sort of burbling up and down and sort of adds to the ritual significance of it. So on the one hand, the silent film would be more oppressive perhaps, but there's something very disturbing about the soundtrack as it was added. And also Jarman adds coloured filters to the film, so that coloured gels, so that the landscape becomes, it takes on these kind of yellows and reds. It becomes very oppressive, and all these imperfections that we see, the blurs and blotches and scratches and jumps, the sense I get from it, it's almost as though there's something kind of that's being uncovered, that's coming up, seeping through and impregnating the film. It's as though deep layers of history are beginning to claw their way up to the surface. I mean, overall, I find it really strange, a profoundly uneasy film, and we get the sense all the way through as though something terrible is about to happen as we're watching it. I just wanted to end by returning to that wonderful phrase by Mivannwy Evans, which I think both Nash and Jarman, and definitely Daniel and Clara too, are responding to at Avebury, and that's the accumulated intenseness of the past as present. Thanks very much. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I think there's definitely a book somewhere that needs to be written about artists and Avebury. I think there's so many interesting things, and I think you could be the person for the job, Susan. Okay, we're going to take a short 5-minute break now, and then we'll have the final leg of our journey to Mersey Island, and then we'll be inviting all the different speakers back for any questions that you have. So yeah, we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Okay, so we're on the final leg of our journey. So as many of you know, we've spent the last year on Mersey Island, which is an island that sits at the end of the Blackwater estuary, about 30 minutes from Colchester in Essex. And we were here staying with family when the lockdown was announced, and we'd only planned to be here for a short amount of time, but due to everything that happened, we decided to stay, and we've stayed here much longer than we'd anticipated. And we were really grateful to have a place to go outside of the city while everything that's been happening over this last year has been going on. And as we were here and the daily news was coming in about case numbers and deaths, and the anxiety was increasing, we were all sort of finding ways to navigate a new way of sort of being in public spaces. And we personally found a great relief in our permitted 1 hour's walk per day, which we were using to explore the island. Mersey Island is quite well populated, but during that first couple of weeks of the first lockdown, we could easily walk for an hour and not see a single person or hear a single car. And this was very sort of magical, really, and quite eerie. So we took to walking the same route every day. We'd leave our house and walk down an avenue past neatly gardened houses to the beach, and then we'd walk along the sand and shingle to this wooded area of wildly entangled trees and overgrown bushes, which we call the Dragon's Nest. And then we'd go from here along a tree-lined path past fields and then back to the main road that leads to our house. And we walked this route over and over, at first once a day and then twice, walking in circles, taking the same path. This act of repetition attuned our attention to the details of the landscape. And we got to know particular trees and features of the landscape, and also got to know particular birds, which we'd see in the same places each day, and we'd notice their territorial disputes and routines. And so through this time, we witnessed the arrival of spring, and we feel like we saw it in a way that we never had done before. The painter David Hockney, who spent a lot of time looking at and depicting landscapes, has said that spring is not a season, but an event. And we can agree to this, that last spring for us was an event of such drama and beauty that we can't help but feel that this aspect of the lockdown was a great gift. Just before the lockdown started, we'd been given an old iPhone, and we'd not used a smartphone for making work before, but we're really interested in different image making tools, and we wanted to see what we could do with this device. So we carried it with us on our daily walks and began making a series of videos called On the Island. This consists of 100 short single shot videos, each one around a minute long, which were filmed over 1 year and released on Instagram as we made them. They depict us in the landscapes of the island, looking and listening to our surroundings. We started these out of a need to create something about the experience that we were having, but at the same time felt unable to make something complicated. It needed to be as simple as possible, something that was just very direct. So we stripped back all the layers and got rid of as much as possible and reduced the action to a bare minimum. It's just us in the landscapes for a short moment in time. We had some references in mind. We were thinking of them in a way as going back to the origins of filmmaking, to the first films of people like the Lumieres. And we were also thinking about the history of painting that depicts figures in landscapes. But what was most important was this simple action of going out into the landscapes, looking, listening, and recording. And as we created more of them, we understood the importance of time in this project, how a different experience and perspective is revealed through repetition, ritual, and routine, and how through the accumulation of parts over time, we can begin to see the impact of light, weather, and seasons on place and in turn on us. As humans, we look for patterns to create meaning, and the patterns of nature often serve as a structure for creating a sense of meaning and purpose in our own lives. We look out for patterns that exist out there and relate them to what is happening within ourselves. The cycles of nature correspond to the cycles in our own lives, in our body and our psychology. Essentially, what we're seeing in On the Island is the effect of the movement of the earth around the sun and how drastically this affects everything, both what's happening in the landscape, but also what's happening in us. What we never expected is that this process of making these videos here over the course of a year would create such a deep personal connection to this place. It turned out to be an experience of tuning into the landscape, connecting to the island and putting down roots. And after so many years of living in different places, this is the first time we've really started to have this sense of belonging to a place, of feeling at home. So we'd like to end now by showing you just one video from the On the Island series, and then we'll have some time for some questions. Okay, we're gonna invite everybody back to join us. And if anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to turn on your microphone and ask away.
Sadly, Andrew and Eden have had to go. But Andrew said that if anyone had questions for him, put them on the chat and we'll send them to him and he'll reply.
So Edgar, got your hand raised.
Hiya. I had a question for Ben in particular, but also open to just talk about it in general. But I was thinking when you were talking about not being able to capture, I think it was Jake's perspective, or the guy that you were documenting's perspective, and I was kind of thinking a lot about authenticity and in connection to like sincerity and things like this. And I was wondering if you had much of a battle in your works with thinking about authenticity and that kind of strange quality that it can give to a piece of work. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you know, in a way, that's what I was trying to get at is when you think about authenticity. I mean, it's a complicated term, because like, what does that mean? Are you being you trying to be objectively authentic,
Yeah.
or I think for me it's like I'm trying to be authentic or as honest as possible in presenting the world as maybe I see it, you know, like it's and if that includes these different layers and different kind of ways of world building that are specific to me, you know, that's probably the best truth I can get at. You know, because it's like, yeah, I wouldn't attempt to like try and really get Jake's perspective in a way. You know, it has to be about, as I said, like it's much more about the perspective of me meeting him, me being in that place at that particular time, surrounded by that particular landscape in that season. And yeah, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I forgot to add a little detail, which was like I kind of am questioning whether the authenticity is more important within the artist or the place. So for instance, Daniel and Clara's film, where it took you 6 years to kind of represent that place, you know, whether it's the place and you, or a bit of both, or solely to do with the artist, and whether that is kind of, because I think it's, you know, it can make and break something sometimes, you know, intentions, sincerity. You know, you going to find Jake relied on the fact that you weren't sure on whether you wanted to live in the city or not. So it's like, you know, you going to explore that says more about you than maybe Jake. So I don't know, that's kind of what I was trying to ask it, and trying to verify maybe that opinion on your side.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's at least as much about me as it is about him, and the place. And as I sort of as I was saying, like the fact that my filmmaking is so interconnected with my life, and so my experience of the landscape is often in relation to having a camera in my hand, and yeah, I think the films often come out of going to a place or meeting a person and feeling like a strong spark, you know, whatever mysterious thing you can't quite put your finger on, and that in turn then leads me to want to kind of spend more time there, or spend more time with this person. And in a way, making the film is a way, is almost like an excuse to do that, to be more entrenched in this place. But yeah, I can't separate like myself and my camera away from the thing that's in front of me, you know. So that I think, you know, for me it's more authentic to be open about the fact that it's I would never be able to be a factual filmmaker. Yeah.
Is that Roger with a question?
Oh yeah. When 2 Years at Sea played at the Alchemy Film Festival in Hawick, and Jake attended, and he was a lovely guy, we met him, but he did a Q&A, and he seemed fully aware that he was fiction. He was like complicit in the whole process of being fictionalized in the film. It's like it's not like you've kind of found this man in the woods and kind of almost, you know, in a sort of patronizing way, kind of put your view of him onto him. It seems like did you have like discussions with him beforehand? He seemed like fully happy to be an actor in the role of himself.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I'm glad you got that impression from him, because that's how we talked a lot before making the film, and the way we kind of talked about it was that this was sort of an image of, like, kind of an image of him, but was somebody very much like, and leaving some things out. I'm just going to turn off my video, actually, because I know I just get chased around by bad internet all the time. But yeah, so we're talking about this idea of it being a kind of exaggeration of certain parts of his character, because that's also the kind of film that I wanted to make. And so in a sense, he's kind of acting, or he's at least, reenacting some parts of his life. He's acting some parts. And I think in a way that made him more comfortable, that we could do things I don't know, as long as they were things that he was comfortable with. I mean, I never did anything that he was uncomfortable with. But it meant that it probably, for him, it probably meant that it wouldn't get too personal as well, or something like that. We could call everything a construction.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it was a really nice collaborative process, and he's shown the film a lot himself up in Scotland, and we're actually planning a sequel at the moment. Yeah.
I think just want to respond to this as well from something that we experience is when we kind of, the desire to make a work about a place or a subject comes, and we start engaging with it by, making a film or taking photographs or starting to write about it. It becomes a way for you to kind of really put your attention to it. And I think, and we film a lot in our daily life as well. And it becomes almost this way that we allow ourselves to engage with whatever it is that we're filming. Our attention sort of focus through the camera, and so it sort of opens up a relationship there, and we're kind of opening ourselves to the place, but we're also kind of investing into it and investigating it in a way. And I think, being kind of aware and sincere, honest about that exchange is just has to be a part of the work. And we don't really have documentary ambitions. We know that we're not making something that is to be a kind of objective account of a place or any of the subjects that we take, and we don't expect that people see it like that. But I think an interesting thing that happens when artists create images from a place or whatever subject is, that those images then become part of the reality of what that place is. And I think this is something that in Susan's book, I think she really kind of brings that journey to the surface, is how much the sort of reality of a British landscape that exists, or it pre-exists in our minds, has grown from all these artists throughout time, reacting to it and discovering new things, or putting their own personal inner landscapes out there for others to engage with. And in some senses, then we are navigating a landscape that exists out there, but it's also composed of all these different inner experiences through time.
Yes, can I just say that's really fascinating to me, actually, and it makes it so much more complex, that it's not just, it can never be, I assume, I'm not an artist, but I can never be an artist looking at a landscape, say, with a vision that is totally kind of virgin, as it were. You must be always negotiating other artists and all of those sort of filters you have in your mind, which kind of add depth and resonance to your work. But I mean, are you, when you were at Avebury or where you are now, have you been aware of that, and aware of perhaps at Avebury negotiating Nash and Jarman, or do you sort of try to put it out of your mind and really fix on you being there in that place?
I think we try to be true to our experience, and if it includes the baggage, you know, that comes with cultural baggage, personal baggage, we want that to be a part of it. We're trying to, you know, respond to that. We know that it's like complex and layered, and actually we don't want to sort of pretend that it's simple, pretend that it's possible to kind of have this, like, as you say, virgin view of something. I think what's interesting is these layers and how they're informing us, and I think it's really interesting to sort of understand those. And for us, one of the things that I think this maybe is expressed also through this talk is this journey that we've been on is one of, and I think this connects to a lot of how all of us relate to place, is this idea of home and connection to something. And I think for us, because our life is completely dedicated to making art and living in the creative process, part of our idea of home has been trying to find some kind of root, some kind of tradition that we feel that we're connected to. And for a long time, we kind of like, there was these kind of figures that were important to us, and, you know, places that were sort of inspiring to us, but we never really felt like we kind of belonged, that we had that sense of home. And it was when we went to Avebury, part of what was so significant about that experience was the sort of the mysterious impact, the thing that can't be explained in words, the atmosphere. But it was also the sort of thing that happened after that initial experience of discovering that there was all these other people responding to it, and that actually their intentions with their work corresponded to our intentions, that, you know, it sort of helped us understand who we were and what we were doing and where we wanted to go. So for us, it's always, it would never be like a sort of negotiation with those things of the past and those other images, but almost like actually it's become embracing them, and it's been deepening our understanding of our own journey of ourselves by not denying anything, by letting everything in and just sort of saying yes to it all as much as possible. And it's sort of, for us now, very sort of exciting and gives us energy. And I think this whole, the concept of this whole talk was about that as well, really. But by bringing in all these people and all these references, I think is to kind of deepen this understanding of the connection between these things.
I think there's like, sometimes things act on you unconsciously or just in the back of your mind, and then at some time, but then when they kind of become conscious, you can't repress, or at least like we feel like we don't want to kind of suppress or put things out of our minds. If it comes into consciousness, then we kind of have to say yes to it and move with it, and it always takes us somewhere else. But I think really now there's always many things going on in different levels, and there's things that we are conscious of and that we work directly with, and then there's things that are moving through that we maybe will become aware of in time. And I think we are aware that this is happening to us, and we just have to accept it and navigate it.
So can I just ask one more question? I mean, are you going to stay, because you're obviously so deep in the work you're doing at Mercy Island now, but do you have plans to stay, or do you have an idea of, is there another place that you have in mind that you want to explore?
I think so. We're staying with family. We're still kind of like still with family as we have been throughout lockdown, and so that question is on our minds. We feel like we're going to stay in the area. Where exactly, that will be partly a sort of economic problem that we have to solve, and it'll be sort of working that out. But it feels like this landscape has just so much more to offer us, and it also feels one that, of course, there is a lot of artistic tradition here, but it doesn't seem to have the same level of exploration as some other places. Obviously there's Constables from this area, there's Gainsborough, there is a lot, but it still feels for us that there's lots of things that haven't been revealed, lots of secrets to discover. And I think finding a landscape that also it's like it does have that history, as we've been talking about, but that also has kind of more to be revealed, I think is quite exciting as well. So but at the moment, I mean definitely East Anglia is sort of like on our minds as an area of home.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Really for Daniel and Clara, but maybe for the other artists as well. Well, you've specifically talked about in your work, you said we want our work to be mysterious. We want the message to be out of reach. And in doing so, it feels like you create a space for the audience to contribute and create their own interpretations of your work. So could you just expand on this process, whether it's the approach you carry with you all the time filming when you're out in the landscape, or whether it's part of the editing process back in the studio, sort of that creating of space for your films that you call equivalents, when to stop and not cross a line. So it'd be great to know more.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like a core philosophy underneath, and it's this giving value to the uniqueness of everybody's experience and not wanting to tell people what to think or feel. And I think we live in a climate of art at the moment which is very message driven, it's very statement driven, and I think this is a very complicated thing to explain, and I maybe don't want to go too much into trying to like unpick why we're at that stage with art where it's really validated on the relevance of its commentary. But we definitely live in this moment where art as something political is kind of like the dominant sort of form, and the one that seems to be most valued within certain institutions. And we're sort of aware that that kind of art is driven by having a message, by having something they want to tell the viewer. And really our experience of art, the art we love, the art that inspires us, that liberates us, that really just fires us up to kind of make art and to kind of like just live a full life, is art that is open, the art that is sort of like a mysterious encounter that's pushing you beyond the limits of your own kind of understanding of yourself. And that art is never kind of like narrow. It's never something where you can say it's very specifically about this. So it's almost like art that at different points we come back to it. It's like Nash. Every time we come back to Nash, it's sort of like different somehow. The work's obviously physically the same, but it's almost like as we change, it changes. The more we're capable of understanding, the more it can give us. And I really think that power comes from the fact that it's not trying to tell us anything. It's coming from some deep human need to respond to something with an image, with a work of art, and kind of bring it into consciousness, bring something into consciousness. And I think we're kind of driven by a desire to make work that's like that. And I think that the way that we do this is we experiment with, we have these encounters and we experiment with image making. We try to create atmospheres. We never try to say, let's take that atmosphere and transcribe it to the film. Let's allow that process of responding to that atmosphere to become a thing in itself. So sometimes we talk about almost like the works are like landscapes in themselves. When you stand in front of a landscape, it's you and that thing, and you've got all these, you're having this experience of like sensations in the body and thoughts and associations, but they're very particular to you. And we want to make work that kind of has that same impact, that when you encounter it, you sort of are having all of those things going on. And it's also trying to kind of find ways to make you conscious of that, so you can become aware of, whatever you're thinking or feeling while you're watching our work, we feel is valid. Like if you're bored, if you're having halfway through your mind trails off and you're thinking about some other thing, that is a part of your experience. That's the reality of that. And the work isn't telling you to have that, but it's happening as a result of that kind of alchemical connection between you and the work. And yeah, I think that's really what we're kind of sort of going for and what we're after.
And I think it's I don't know how we make those decisions. I think in some ways we wouldn't be able to do the other thing. The way that we the way that we work is that as we're manipulating the images, or even as we're pointing the camera and looking at something, it just has to become activated, and there's really no other word for it. It's just, I don't know what it is. It's like an aesthetic thrill. It's something that actually feels wrong, but you then find out it's right. It's just a kind of instinct and feeling. And in when we were in Portugal in our isolation, we were working really hard to get in tune with that and understand and strengthen that that feeling, which is the feeling that tells you if something working or not. And every artist will understand what that mysterious thing is when you're looking at an image, when you're making a cut, and will have their own language to express what is happening, because it's just a mystery. We have quite a few questions here on the chat, so I just wanted to let's have a look and see if we can answer them. So from Michael, for any of the artists, are there ever times where your project or practice is also a barrier to enjoying nature or seeing and simply getting lost in place, where the thinking forward or anticipating how a moment might be presented or articulated or contextualized interrupts the experience of the moment? And how do you stay open and alert?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for us, the making art in the landscape is almost like a ritual to engage. Like when we go out with sort of our cameras, it's almost like actually it's attuning our attention to looking even more. So by simply kind of having this, I think when you're an artist, you're kind of always looking, like you're sort of like sort of a bit of a magpie for the things that are relevant to your practice. So you're always kind of like paying attention. And I think actually like it's something that, especially I think for us, it's like that, isn't it? Yeah. It's like it helps us actually engage on a kind of deeper level. I don't know how about for you, Ben?
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I think, yeah, but I'm not also the sort of person who walks around with my camera all the time. I like to spend a lot of time in forests and the desert or wherever this landscape might be. And yeah, I do spend a lot of time there actually without my camera and just trying to get inspired by it or take it in on one kind of level, but it excites my imagination quite a lot while I'm there. And so I inevitably am thinking about films and filmmaking and world making within those places and responding to them. So yeah, then I'll probably go back with my camera with some, with some idea of what I want to do and like how I want to respond to it. And then it sort of moves into the thing that you just kind of talked about, where, it does kind of enable you to sort of focus and maybe look closer or yeah, I think in a way it makes me spend a lot of time looking and seeing how maybe a landscape changes due to the weather or the light or a person moving through it. And then I sort of try and go about doing something with that creatively, and exploiting it.
Yeah, I think art is so much about looking and paying attention and attuning your attention to things that maybe normally are overlooked or kind of ignored. I think art's so good at that, and it, depending on whatever your personal subject is, the things that kind of sort of speak to you, I think it's like almost our duty as artists to kind of really give ourselves to those kind of obsessions, to kind of create a space where it can come to consciousness, can come to kind of attention for people. I think that's one of the roles of art. Shall we, is there another question?
The question, yeah. How important was for you your experience of displacement in Portugal, an important platform for the quest of place and belonging? Is from Caroline. Well, I think it was the thing we needed at the time, and we didn't know why we needed. There's certain things in our minds at that point, and we were also there for quite a long time. So actually, even during the period that we lived there, we went through different phases and of what we were focusing on, what our attention was on, and what the work was doing. But I think what was great about it, in a sense, was the fact that we did have kind of restrictions in the way that we were living. There was a lot of time that was spent just on maintaining the house, and preparing the food and all of those things. And restrictions sometimes can be good for focusing creativity. And I think there was a lot of things that, because we were living there, we weren't thinking about. And so it meant that our energy and our focus that were available were all put onto things that for us then were absolute priority. And but there was also this feeling of something lacking, and that obviously kind of then ended up with us moving away from it. But also, all experiences have their I guess more negative aspects of feelings and the things they're getting, and often actually the everything is in a sense a kind of can enrich what it is. But it taught us and gave us the opportunity to give ourselves completely to something, and also understand how much we can achieve by doing that.
I'd like to follow up on that, actually, what you've just been saying there, Clara, because it's really interesting. For me, this whole talk about belonging, sense of belonging and an emotional connection you have with places is really really interesting. And it's almost like a kind of sense of recognition about a place. Because, for instance, I never, weirdly, and this is really weird, never felt a strong connection with Brighton, even though I grew up there. I was brought up there and everything. But I instantly felt a strange connection, a very deep connection with Wiltshire as soon as I went there as a child with my dad. And especially, as we've been talking about Avebury, when I connected with Avebury at the age of 14, which was a very intense experience and an amazing revelation to go there at that time. But then also when I took myself off after my dad died, I decided to leave Brighton because of everything that had happened and just remove myself completely to a rural setting, which I'd never really experienced fully before, to live in. And the whole experience of Suffolk resonated so deeply, and it was an instant sense of recognition that this was a place that was home rather than Brighton, which was a really weird thing to kind of connect with. And that really inspired a lot of work, actually. And it was really feeling like just walking through the fields in Suffolk felt like a creative act in itself. It felt like I was being creative just by walking through and experiencing what it was like there, hearing the wind and the sounds and seeing the hawks and, you know, the hares running about and all these amazing things that you see when you're alone in the fields and stuff. It was a very, very deep resonance, that, and it really connects with what you've been talking about before about all this. You know, it's quite an extraordinary thing, and it really inspired, you know, me to make a film of that whole tied in with the grieving process. But it was a really interesting time in my life where I felt a really deep connection with the land and a particular area. You know.
Yeah. It's really mysterious.
And that, I find that really fascinating. That can happen. And like places abroad as well that I've been, I feel a deeper connection with certain places abroad than I do with my own hometown. And it's a very weird thing, that.
Yeah.
It's quite hard to find, I think. But it is down to a sense of recognition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some strange way. And
it is really strange how the feeling of home comes about. And it's like, for our understanding really that repetition is a part of it, but that's not the whole story. But I think they're building a certain kind of ritual and repetition, and then because what happens then, that creates memories in a place as well. Then you kind of recognize that certain patterns have happened previously, certain experiences have become sort of located in the place that then give that place meaning, which I think is quite interesting. We read about sort of some ideas about the origins of Avebury, and how that landscape was kind of used very early on. And there's sort of some ideas about how people were kind of moving through this place, moving through the sort of chalk downs, you know, in our sort of prehistoric ancestors. And they would only stay there for certain seasons. They wouldn't stay there all of the time. But then at the end of the season, they would dig pits and they would put all of their rubbish into pits and then cover them over. And then they would move on. And then the next year they would come back to the same area and the pit would start to kind of like be a recognizable space that they would return to. And that sort of sense that their ancestors, their family had been in that place before, and there was some kind of like marker that they'd been there, I think started to create this sense of a meaning and a connection to the landscape. So ancestors and family history sort of got tied to place in some way. And I think there's something really interesting about that kind of just a sort of, you know, material thing. It's like a practical thing to bury rubbish and to kind of move, you know, to move on. But then it kind of like builds an element of like mystery, maybe even the original kind of knowledge of why they were returning to that place is forgotten. But the ritual's kind of ingrained. They know that our grandfather and our great-grandfather kind of went here, and that's something really interesting about that, how that sort of relationship and meaning kind of comes, and actually the source might be cut off, but the feeling kind of persists.
There's one more question here in the chat from Catherine, and this is a question for all the speakers. She'd like to ask or hear a little more about your views on the landscape, on the relationship between time and landscape, and how you navigate this in your work. The present tense, past tense, how do the ghosts of a place manifest? Ben, do
It's
you
a
have
good
any?
one.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. Yeah, it's huge question in a way. It's good. You could write a whole book about that, but yeah, I mean, well, it's certainly something that I've thought about a lot. And yeah, the last sort of longer films I made in 2019, Ghost Strata and Crabby 2562, are both pretty much trying to deal with this very thing of looking at different sort of time signatures in a particular landscape. So Crabby is essentially a kind of portrait of that area of Krabi in southern Thailand. And I made this film with my friend Anosha Surisha Kornpong, and you know, we're trying to kind of approach it like you know, looking at a place but slipping through various areas of time, not only kind of, I suppose, like real calendar time, but also mythic time and geologic time, you know. So it's not just sort of human, you know, sort of human time. It's it's these other kinds of ways that a landscape has changed, and also then applying that to cinematic time, which is a very different experience to lived time. So you know, when you show a 5-minute static shot of something in the cinema, that takes on a very different feeling to you know, it's probably easy for us to look at something for 5 minutes in real life, you know, to just sit on a bench and look at the sea. But if you do that in the cinema, it's a completely different experience, because we come with certain expectations of what cinema is supposed to deliver. So yeah, I think in my films a lot I'm trying to like kind of move between past, present, future, mushroom time, rock time, you know, and yeah, so you know, it's a bit like the same as what we were talking about in terms of the many layers to the way that we see things, and the different things that that influence the way that we experience things. You know, time is another sort of element to that. And yeah, with Ghost Strata, I mean, there's a section in that which is a little bit more direct, which is where I talk to Jan Zelastovic, who's a geologist, really great geologist, and he I think coined this term Ghost Strata, which is basically like some layer of the strata that is no longer there anymore, and so there's a gap, and it's then their job to then kind of fill that gap, to understand what was there and what created it. And these gaps can be natural or they can be human made. And I thought that was a really nice analogy for thinking about cinema and art making, and memory and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's great.
So I think we have like time for maybe 2 more questions, and then
there was someone, Edgar.
Oh, Edgar, yeah.
I just had like a slight observation on some of the thoughts Susan was bringing with her presentation, and some things that you touched on in the difference between Stonehenge and Avebury. And I was just thinking, as you were talking about those things, of like composition, and how just Stonehenge's design and composition as a structure can be viewed by one person on their own. They can see the whole view of Stonehenge, whereas Avebury is more of an experience, and you know, not everyone is able to get into see Avebury from a bird's eye view. So it's like, I was just thinking about that as a way of thinking about the moving image in general, you know, and that's where its power is you know, moving images more like Avebury as an analogy, because it's like, you know, you're bringing together a perspective of like the pure emotional like power that that place has, compared to Stonehenge, where it's more of a, you know, if it was more of an image or a painting. And Susan said about her confusion over, I think it was Paul Nash's painting that has is from like a bird's eye view, and it's got that thing in the middle, and how that painting is quite similar to what the moving image can do, because it is confusing, and it is, you don't really know sometimes what the meaning is, but that kind of weird object in the middle of that painting is that idea. Maybe I was just thinking about that. Yeah,
I think this relates to something that we've thought about a lot as well, which is about the similarities and differences between painting and moving image, and in terms of narrative. And what a fascinating thing that a painting has a narrative that is all there present at the same time. All the elements are just there, and you can see it all in one glance. So in a way, you can experience the narrative immediately, and then you can also kind of take your time looking at the different elements and experience it in that time-based way. Whereas with moving image, for most moving image, you can't really have a glance vision of the whole thing in one go. Your experience is completely time-based. And also that means also that the images, as you're being given the different elements, they have this accumulative effect. And the meaning really is only completely given to you at the end, when you kind of step out.
And then as a memory.
And as a memory, and as an experience that you sort of revisit. In a sense, I think there is something that is very close to life in moving image, in that it gives you that experience, whereas a painting you can engage with differently. And I think, you know, maybe there is something that's one of the amazing things about Avebury that maybe lends itself to moving image, that it's already has to be this fragmented experience in a way, which I feel like it's just how we experience it is in fragments. And I think, you know, painting was opening up to this at the turn of the century, turn of last century, and influenced by film in many senses. And film kind of then was going for this suspension of disbelief, but there was always also really the tradition where you completely embraced that fragmentation of an associative type of relation and meaning of images.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about. That's very well thought out.
But I think also that, I think Nash's painting sort of does try to kind of do something new and give you this kind of, what I was trying to, thinking about was the symbolic layers, which I think sort of aren't quite there in Constable and Turner, or they are, but in more of a kind of visual wow sort of way. But I think what Nash is, I just find that painting really mysterious, and what I think he's doing is trying to sort of express more of an experiential way of looking than a purely visual way. And just the other little thought I had after Edgar's question was just, it does make you wonder what purpose they were built. And because this whole thing about Avebury is that you can't see it all, that you can only experience bits of it at a time, and almost confront one stone after the other, or be in one part but not in the other. So does give you a sense of that must have been in the minds of people who created it, that's part of the experience you're supposed to have for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a narrative that was inscribed in the landscape that you have to experience in that narrative way that you also experience, say, with moving image, where you go from certain experiences, you would follow the avenue, and then as you enter into the circle, you see certain stones first, and then move on to there's like different rooms also within the stone circle. And I feel like that's, it relates to theater, dance, cinema, and just that general almost narrative impulse that underpins a lot of art.
Yeah, I just to add one thing, not to take up too much time, but one of my perspectives on it is they're like a sculptural experience that is very similar to walking down a city or being in New York. Those stones are way bigger than man, and skyscrapers almost have a similar effect. If you're walking down the street, you have this like not empirical, but like this very strong I don't know what I'm trying to say, but you can maybe understand what like I feel like the connection to those places used to be and are pretty much the same today. Things don't change that much.
Yeah, I think that's something that we always feel. The more we sort of study history and the further back we go, the more it sort of seems to shrink, and it just feels like actually humans aren't really any different to how they've ever been, and that really there's this kind of idea that maybe the people who built Avebury were more connected to the landscape than we are now, and there may be some element of truth to that they definitely had a slightly different relationship. But I think the very fact that they had to build something like that, I think, shows a kind of disconnection, that they needed a ritual, they needed an intervention to engage with place. If they weren't so engaged that they simply could be, they had, the sort of need to make art in response to these things almost kind of expresses a sort of a gap. I think it's quite interesting to sort of think of it in that way, that because I think there's a sort of romanticized idea that our ancestors were in harmony with nature, whereas I think actually we probably have pretty much the same relationship now that we've always had. It's just that our impact is more visible now.
That's my view as well.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. So I think we maybe have like one more question here. Was there?
There's a question from Pete about Joyce. Joyce apparently could only write about Dublin when he was in Paris. Is that an experience any of you have felt in your practice? That sometimes the distance from a place, either temporally or spatially, is necessary to creating work about a place.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and there's a lot of things we could say about that, because I think it comes back to this understanding of there's the inner and outer experience of place. So I think if you're making a work in a place, it's one kind of experience, but then if you're making a work about a place where not there, it's maybe can still be about that place, but maybe the emphasis is more on that sort of not being there, at least for us. One project we worked on last year, we'd planned to go to Cornwall to do a project about the standing stones in Cornwall last spring, but because we couldn't go, we decided to kind of make it on Mersey. And so we kind of created this sort of, first of all, we camped in the garden, we put the tent up, and we made a home movie as if it was like a holiday film of going to Cornwall. And we wrote a diary about what happened on our journey to Cornwall, because on one level, the experience of going to Cornwall had already begun, because we'd been looking at Google Maps, we'd been reading guidebooks, we'd been planning where we were going to stay, where we were going to go. So this kind of experience had already begun. And it's almost like there's something really amazing about when you read a book, it becomes a reality. It gets kind of like absorbed into your consciousness in some ways, and actually even though it's like not something you physically experience, you've experienced the kind of mental and emotional reality of that thing. And I think that's something that can happen, I think, and something we were kind of interested in experimenting with, of making a work about this place but without actually having been there. So I think maybe our work about Cornwall is as much about Cornwall as someone going there and making a work about Cornwall. I don't know if it makes it any less about that or not, because I think all experiences of reality are inner experiences. It's very hard to kind of step outside of that. So
yeah.
And I'm sure, this is something surely that Joyce would have been interested in as well, because he's so much about consciousness and all of the layers of experience. And yeah, I think he's definitely also like impacted on our ideas about the multiple levels of experience.
I think there's also another thing that happens, which is the thing that happened to us about Avebury. It's a place somehow becomes this source of creative energy and inspiration. And I think maybe that's what Dublin was for Joyce. It was like his source of where he could access that creative energy, and being away from it sometimes can be that you can then just focus more on the creative aspects that you're working on, rather than getting bogged down with the actual place. It can just be that source of energy. And it's interesting because in Stella's talk, it actually sounds like maybe, for example, the Wiltshire and Suffolk had that for Jeff too. I wonder if that's what these important experiences for him became something that he could drew on for creative energy.
Definitely, yeah.
I can imagine that Jeff was into Joyce as well.
Yes, all sorts of stuff. He read voraciously as well. Yeah, no, for sure.
I was thinking it's one of the best things about. Oh, sorry, Stella. Go ahead, Stella. I didn't know you.
Say that he had so many ideas. It was like, that thing of transitioning from painting to film was a way of getting the ideas out faster, really. It was a quicker methodology of getting as many ideas put down as possible. I think painting is quite limited in that way. But yeah, sorry, Ben, carry on.
No, I was just going to say that, just to follow up, yeah, I mean, for me, it's one of the best things about filmmaking is that you've got these two very different kind of parts of it. These two experiences. One is the filming, which is the bit that you're in the place, or for me at least, it's about responding to the place. It's about being there, being inspired by it. And that's the kind of adventure part of filmmaking, where there's also a lot of unknowns and chance encounters, etc. And then there's the editing part, which I've never done in the place. I've always gone back to London, and that creates this really useful distance, I think, to the place that, as you were saying, Daniel, it's sort of that's where you can allow a different kind of creativity to then take action. And yeah, in a way that sort of allows you to kind of let go of some of the things that maybe you were sort of hanging on to in the place itself, and gives you a kind of new kind of freedom to rethink this material. Yeah. So yeah, I think that kind of distance is really great. It also made me think of a Nathaniel Hawthorne story called Mr. Potts of Pottstown, which is about a guy who runs a sort of adventuring mountaineering club, but he's never been mountaineering ever.
That's great. Okay, well, I think that's time to end, but thank you so much for everyone for spending the morning with us. It's been really great to share our work, and also just to hear from all of these amazing speakers. We're so happy to have had you all with us. So I'd just like to say thank you to Susan and to Ben and to Stella and to Jess, and of course Andrew and Eden, who've had to go. Just thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel and Clara, for setting it all up.